Well, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you. Yeah, and I noticed on your pie chart that there were no journalists on there. I am a journalist, so congratulations. You're kicking off your inaugural data science conference with someone who knows very little about data science. So it's funny because I did get an astronomy degree from the University of Texas, but I realized after my junior year and taking 4 semesters of calculus that this was not the chosen path for me. And I tell you that for 3 reasons. First of all, if anyone asks me to start integrating anything, I'm out of here. Second, what really drives journalists more than anything else is deadlines. It's like grant writing, but every day. And so I didn't finish the presentation until this morning, so if there are errors, that's why. And then finally, I have no idea how long it is. So we'll find that out. It'll be a happy discovery for us today. So I wanted to, let's see. I'm not sure which way to go forward here. It's not. Oh, there. Is it working out?
Yeah. Which way you want to go?
Let's go back.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
The other way?
Yeah. All right, so let's begin at the beginning with Tropical Storm Allison. Now, some of you will remember this storm, but with a lot of younger faces, some of you will not. This was a storm 16 years ago. It became the costliest tropical storm in U.S. history. It was, I'll talk more about why it was considered the worst case scenario for flooding in Houston. Damage was heavy here at Rice, the Texas Medical Center nearby. 22 deaths, cars, homes, $5 billion in flood damage. And I was a lot younger. I remember that night. So the storm came in like on June 5th or 6th. And it dumped 6 to 10 inches of rain, then it moved off. But it came back on the 8th, the night of the 8th. But that was a different time. There were no smartphones, people weren't using the internet as much, and so there was much kind of less of a realization that night it was going to get really bad. And I was actually writing about science for the Chronicle at the time, so I should have known better, but it was a Friday night, so I went out for some beers in Midtown with friends. It was raining pretty heavy, but we said, well, let's go over to Washington Avenue and see a concert. And so I remember it was probably about 11 o'clock or so in the Continental Club, which I don't think is open anymore. And it was Bob Schneider, and the rain falling on the roof was louder than the show. At that point, we were like, well, we should probably go. So we got outside, and I lived north of I-10 at the time and couldn't get across I-10 because it was a waterway. And we ended up basically walking around the city the entire night. And it was pretty crazy. It was a crazy flood storm. So this is what it looked like outside of Ben Taub, and this was the morning after, so the storm had moved through and the worst of the flooding had gone on. This was just down the street from here in the Texas Medical Center. Anyone who was here kind of remembers this storm, and in the years afterward, we treated it as kind of the realistic worst case scenario for the Houston metro area. We're not going to get another Allison. Everything was measured against Allison, and sort of with the expectation is, boy, it's never going to get that bad again. And we just kind of took that to be the case, and that was kind of what everything was built toward. It also actually inspired me to go into meteorology because I never wanted to be sort of caught unawares again like that night I had been, being out all night and not getting home until the next day. So this is the rainfall totals from Allison. Now, that's a 5-day total. And you can see, over here in West Harris County, they didn't understand what the big deal was because they got less than 5 inches of rain. The really heavy rain was kind of here over northeast Houston where you had a pocket of 35 inches and here 35 inches. Down here, where the flooding was baddest in that last night, it was like 15 to 20 inches. Now about 15 of that came, the last night, on the night of the 8th and the 9th. But I want you to remember this chart because this was considered the reference event by which future storms will be compared. And there was a huge disparity across the county in terms of rainfall. Nevertheless, oops, got that backwards. Nevertheless, this was considered off the charts flooding. With Allison, you had the Harris County Flood Control District stepped up and did a report, and they worked with FEMA, and they kind of came in, and they did these determinations of the 100-year and the 500-year floodplain. And if you look on the map up there, you can see that the 500-year flooding area, well, that's pretty big, It goes all the way from downtown to the east side and out to the northwest side. But in the report after the storm, which was called Off the Charts, it was described as an extremely rare event. Okay? And this was our flood control district working in concert with FEMA. Okay, so this is a picture of Mike Talbot. He was the director of the Harris County Flood Control District, which, by the way, is a terrible name for an agency. Because, if you were here during Harvey, did you see anyone controlling the floods? Like, the waters went where they were going to go. And so probably a better way to think about flood control is flood mitigation. But anyway, Talbot retired in 2016. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And kind of toward the end, he was somewhat controversial. And I kind of want to explain why. So you got to have the context of these recent rainfall events to understand this. And it turns out the period from March 1st, 2015 to August 31st was the wettest 18-month period on record for Houston. Now, this is well before Harvey, but you can see the top value there was 120 inches almost. And actually, the top 5 wettest periods came during the last 2 years. And so prior to 2015, you have to go back to find the total of all the way to 2001. Now, what happened in 2001? Tropical Storm Allison. But that was, 106 inches. So that's more than a foot of rain in an 18-month period beyond anything on record in the city. It's just an immense kind of a leap. And one of the big reasons for that is that between May of 2015 and June of 2016, there were these 6 major flood events in Houston. Now, none of them were as big as Allison, which had was over a broader area. But localized, they created these huge effects. These are like the Memorial Day floods, the Tax Day floods, and it's kind of funny. 2 of the events occurred in October of 2015, within 2 weeks of when I founded Space City Weather. And so I don't know if I have very, very good timing or very bad timing. I'm not sure. So this is the context in the summer of 2016 when Talbot is asked, the Texas Tribune and ProPublica do this big series called the Boomtown Floodtown series, and it's quite good. You can Google it and find it. It's easy to get to. But one of the things they did with that was they had an extended interview with Talbot, who had just left his office. And he was asked, what about all this development on the west side of Houston, the northwest side of Houston, the southwest side of Houston? Where are these wetlands? And the prairies, which, are actually, they're not magic, but they are good sponges during the storm. So, if you don't live here, the way the system works is rain falls, over the fields and neighborhoods. It flows into streets. Streets carry it to bayous. Bayous carry it out to the Gulf of Mexico, actually to Galveston Bay and then in the Gulf of Mexico. And so if you have less water flowing into the streets and into the bayous, then you have less flooding. So prairies do help. Now, how much they would have helped with Harvey, I'm not so sure. Perhaps not a whole lot. But to sort of make the claim that development really isn't exacerbating the flooding problem here in Houston is kind of an interesting claim from the guy who led Flood Control District. And I think that this is going to tell us a little bit something about the mindset of flood control in this region. Here's other quotes from Talbot in the article talking about the the rains in 2015 and 2016, it's not the new normal, and maybe he's right, maybe it's not, maybe it was exceptional. Scientists and conservation are anti-development, they have an agenda to protect, and protect the environment, overrides common sense, and when he was asked about, well, who are the experts then to talk to about, flooding and heavy rainfall and things like that, he says, well, start with me. So I think these quotes and kind of this mindset is illustrative of the simple reality of flood control in Harris County and other places in Texas. So the flood control district builds drainage systems, right? So they're not in charge of the big reservoirs on the west side. That's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but they build the bayous, they widen the bayous, they build retention ponds. But, another part of their purpose is really to encourage development. And what I mean by that is, and these are like in areas that are pretty near floodplains or sometimes in floodways. By building this ditch or this bayou or widening existing projects, they sanction new development to some extent where it really shouldn't be, like right next to the reservoirs in West Houston. Now that may sound like a harsh thing to say, but it's really the kind of thing you have to say after a storm like Harvey. And so, speaking of Harvey, okay, so sorry, one more graph here from Talbot. By the way, his own agency did a report showing that Prairie was effective at mitigating, flooding near developments. So anyway, we're going to speak about Harvey now because that's, I think, why I was invited here. But I wanted to kind of give you that backdrop of where we were before August of 2017, kind of the mindset of development and how we had been through Allison, survived this traumatic event, put some flood doors in the medical center, and widened some bayous, and thought we were in decent shape. And then, and then a hurricane forms in the Gulf, and it changed a lot of things. I hope we're going to find out. And so this was from me. I'm going to talk about the meteorology for a minute because that's what is interesting to me. Talk a little bit about the mindset of the storm. So this was at peak intensity. This was Saturday, August 19th. This is a week before the heavy rains start to come into Houston. And the forecast kind of brings it here, but then, none of the global models are really developing, and actually they dissipate it. And that's exactly what happened. Some dry air got in there, some subsidence, and the storm gets to about here in the Caribbean and then dies. All right. Now you got to go back and think about the mindset of that weekend. As a forecaster, I remember exactly what I was thinking about that weekend. I was like, man, well, first of all, I was thinking my kids go back to school Monday, and I'm like, yes, right? But no, like I said, my wife's not here. The second thing, I was thinking is that we're going to have the partial eclipse in Houston on Monday, 67% obscured, and is it going to be cloudy or not? And that was the big question. It was looking like it was going to be a pretty decent chance of cloudy skies, and so that's once this dissipated, I was like, okay, good, we're in good shape. And so the eclipse came, and that was Monday, and for me, the best part of the eclipse on Monday was not the fact that you could see 2/3 of the sun covered if you looked at it through eclipse glasses, that you could step outside at 1 o'clock on a day in August, and it cooled down. God, it felt great. And I thought, man, if only it could be like this every day in August. And the other funny thing I remember, like looking back, is, man, I sure would love some rain to cool things off. And that was a dumb thought in retrospect. Okay, so Monday morning we're back. So this was that morning of the eclipse. Kind of wake up, look at the weather, try to figure out what to write, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute, it's coming back, right? Southern Gulf of Mexico. But at that time, it wasn't sure whether the storm was just going to kind of plow through here and go into Mexico, or if it was going to kind of come up here. The model, there was really no agreement in the modeling. And so I wrote, talking about the upcoming weekend, so this would be the weekend that Harvey ravaged Houston and Beaumont. We could see a couple of inches of rainfall or quite a bit more, and if not, it'll be hot and dry. So when you hear stories about how computer modeling has come along and really improved forecasts, it has, but we got a long way to go. There's still a lot of unpredictability in forecasts. This is just 4.5 days before the storm makes landfall, and that's where we were. Okay, all right. So Tuesday. Now Tuesday, this is by the way the European forecast track model for Harvey on Tuesday. The Europeans have the best forecast model in the world. I'm not going to go into it, but it's good that they do. This was actually the track forecast. It came out, I think, Tuesday afternoon, showing it kind of coming in here, noodling around, and then coming back over here. And that's not quite what happened. It kind of went like this and did this. But this was a fantastic forecast. Anyway, I just remember looking at it thinking, if this happens, like if it just kind of comes in and does a tour of southeast Texas between San Antonio and Galveston, somewhere in here is going to get hit by some heavy rain. And so we started talking about 10 to 15 inches of rain or more. Someone's going to get hit pretty hard. It would be irresponsible to talk about this being a repeat of Allison. Technically true, because it was a lot worse than Allison, but didn't know it at the time. Okay, so then you wake up Wednesday morning and thinking, okay, the storm's coming in a couple days. Let's get some confidence about where it's going. What are you going to do? By the way, I could talk for an hour on spaghetti model plots like this, which you should largely ignore, because there's a handful of global models that do really well with hurricanes, and you look at their ensemble forecasts, and that's really what you pay attention to. But this gives an idea of kind of the uncertainty of the track, and you can see it kind of spinning around here and not having any steering currents, which were obviously the big problem. Okay, so that's where we were, and then by Wednesday, with when it's becoming clear that there aren't really strong steering currents, you start to get concerned. And so I remember putting up this plot or making this plot and saying, look, this area is at risk of 15 inches or more. I'm actually pretty happy about this in retrospect, because it kind of captures the area from Beaumont to Houston that did get 15 inches or more. It just was a lot more than 15 inches. And that's kind of the challenge, right? How do you convey risk? How do you communicate risk when there's not data certainty, right? Because I think by Wednesday afternoon, my thinking was that, okay, some of the forecast modeling here is really grim, and it's been grim for a day or two, and there's a potential with the widespread rain for it actually to be worse than Allison. Didn't believe it, but there was the potential. So maybe there's like a 20% chance worse than Allison, 30% chance about the same, and like a 50% chance it's, anything from like 5 inches to 25 inches, not as bad. And so, it's hard to write that, because if you write, oh my God, Allison's coming, and then it doesn't, you look like a total buffoon, and you're hyping something that's not hyped. But at the same time, you're like, it's time to take this serious. And I think Wednesday was when the lines started to form, grocery stores started to run out of water, things like that. And so then we get to Thursday afternoon, and we have, this was actually the NOAA. So it's NOAA's Weather Prediction Center. They look at all the models and make precipitation forecasts for the next 5 days. And you've got almost 20 inches of rain down here in Brazoria County, and you're looking at this 20 inches down here in Matagorda Bay, and you're thinking, man, that's really extreme. And they did. The reality, really a sobering reality, is that a lot of Harris County received more than 3 times the amount of rain shown on this map, or 2 to 3 times. And I remember, trying to think of a headline to convey our concerns to people about the storm. And I texted my wife and said, what do you think about, holy hell, a lot of rain is coming to Texas? I thought, well, that does a pretty good job of conveying the risk. She's like, don't do that. You got a lot of pastors that read the site in addition to the people from Rice. And they do. So I went with the headline, Harvey, nearly a hurricane, updating the major threats to Texas. Kind of boring, but also got the point across. Okay, so that's Thursday. And over here is kind of what we were saying. And then we get to Friday. And I tried to make it simple for people with the key takeaways here. You know, at that point, we had a couple concerns. Obviously, we were worried about the flood, but the other problem was, you know, the storm was coming in far enough down the coast. We knew that surge wasn't at all a threat for Houston. Winds weren't going to be a threat for Houston. That meant power wasn't going to go out. And, you know, the heavy rains at this point looked like they weren't coming in until Saturday. And so you were going to get to the point where on Saturday, some areas were going to see rain, some people were going to see some partly sunny skies, and I think a lot of people would think, well, that was kind of a damn squib. You know what? That was it? So we were trying to explain to people, you know, what was going on. And so anyway, that's where we were Friday. We felt pretty bad, and we did feel pretty bad. And I remember, like, moving a bunch of stuff up out of my garage because I was, you know, concerned about it flooding. And then this was the cumulative rain forecast for Friday evening. And, you know, again, this again was NOAA, and they'd sort of had reconciled that the models that had been forecasting 30 to 30 inches of rain most of the week were probably going to be right. And so you had 30, 30, 30, and Houston is right here. So between 22 and 27, boy, we'd take that now, wouldn't we? But there was just this, what was amazing about this is just the huge extent of rainfall like this. And remember, Allison had a few isolated areas of 35 inches. Most of it was 25 or less. And here's just this 12 county or more area of 30 inches of rain. It's like, wow, you know, let's hope that doesn't happen. Okay, so then we get to Saturday night, and I just remember sort of sitting there, and by about noon on Saturday, you know, we were pretty confident that that night was going to be like the big night. And so we started warning people, you know, try not to go out, you know, and that was the night of the big fight, and so people were going out, and you could sort of see it developing, but then by 9 o'clock you knew that those mesoscale models that had been showing that there was the potential for a lot of rain that night were going to verify. So you've got, you know, the storm down here, the center down here, and these bands here, and then whoo, the big rain band that kind of moved through West Houston like this, right? And so we said, you know, flooding begins as the worst of Harvey's moisture moves into Houston. And I remember thinking at that time, okay, you know, this is pretty bad. But, you know, let's see what happens after this band moves through. Let's see, this is what I want to do. Okay, right. So a couple hours later then, here's band one. It's moved a little bit from about here to here. And the thinking at the time was, I remember this clearly. I was talking to the partner, a guy named Matt Lanza, who helps me do the site. And, you know, we were kind of at the edge of this major flooding event. This band had come through and dropped like 6 to 10 inches of rain as it moved through, which is a lot, but, you know, the bayous were holding generally. Most homes hadn't flooded yet, and that band was still moving, right? And so you're thinking, okay, well, if this band keeps moving through and this one kind of stays at this intensity, you know, there's enough time in here, the flooding system can recover, and you know, maybe it's not going to be Armageddon. So we wrote, you know, why we're worried about the rest of tonight in Houston, and I outlined two scenarios. I said, one, this band could stop, right? Somewhere over here it could stop, and this band could strengthen as it moves into Houston. Well, both happened. So a couple hours later, we're looking at rain totals, and you've got like 15 inches down here and 14 inches, and most of this is in like 6 hours. And as a matter of fact, like right here, between midnight and 2 a.m., this is Clear Creek at I-45, and I live like right over here. got 10.6 inches of rain in 2 hours. That's 5 inches, more than 5 inches per hour. That's like, rainfall rates meeting or exceeding Allison, and it's not stopping. It's very, very concerning. And lo and behold, what happened then is that both things happened. There's band 1, more than 2 hours later, and it hasn't moved, right? Here's Clear Creek at I-45. It's basically stalled. We were worried about that. Here's band 2. It kind of moved up like this and got huge. It blew up. And eventually this band merges with this. And then at this point, my mental state is kind of weak, so I go with the Star Wars reference here for band 3, which is strengthening and getting ready to move in. I think I called this the super mega rainball of death or something like this. And the National Weather Service a few years ago had created this thing called a flash flood emergency, which they'd issued like 3 or 4 times in its history here. And then just on the fly, they came up with something called a flash flood emergency for catastrophic life-threatening flooding. And that sounded really bad. And so it's like 2:40 in the morning. I'd been up most of the week, and not to sound too flippant, but that sounds really bad. And that's kind of how I felt. And it was after this time that I went outside to see the flooding in my garage and stuff like that. It was kind of a grim situation. Okay. Oops. No, I want to go. No, never mind. I want to say just a word for a minute about this is a data conference, so about rainfall rates. 1/2 inch per hour is heavy rainfall. 2 inches per hour is something that you would, if you were driving on a freeway, you might consider pulling off and waiting for it to pass because you really can't see it. And the bayou capacity in Harris County, 1 to 2 inches per hour for a few hours, it can handle that. Anything above 2 inches per hour, it starts to flood. And so the rainfall rates we were seeing, in these bands here, these were like 5 inches, 4 inches per hour, and they just kind of weren't moving. And so it completely overwhelmed the system to handle it. Okay, so now here's something I wanted to highlight for a data science conference. I'm going to show you kind of a few paragraphs of a post that I published at noon on Sunday. And this was just hours after the worst rains had hit. It slackened a little bit on Sunday. It kind of still rained, but it wasn't 5 inches per hour. It was more like 1/2 inch or 1 inch per hour rainfall rates. And, depending on where you lived, you may not have taken on water. The power's on your house, and so things were cool. But like tens of thousands of people were waking up that night or that next morning, and like when they put their foot out of their bed, they were stepping into water. I mean, it was really a grim situation. And I'd finally fallen asleep that night, got up a few hours later, and then I kind of wrote this, and basically said, oh, sorry, I left the cursor on there. They wanted to do a screenshot. So it was basically a message, that we got 3 or 4 more nights of this still, probably, but we'll get through it. It'll pass eventually. And this was probably the most read, shared, liked thing that I wrote during the entire storm. My wife said she cried when she read it. And as people kind of talk to me, and it's not data, it's sort of emotions. And so, it just kind of the power of, on one hand, you have data, and we had a week of data saying, this looks really, really bad. This could be, it's catastrophic flooding. It could be as bad or worse than Allison. And that resonated with people, but, it's one thing to have data, but, emotional communication and being able to sort of put some emotional oomph by your data as you communicate it to the public, that has real power too. And so like I said, I published this. I woke up the next day and wrote this, and it was just to kind of try to provide people with hope, because I've been writing such this horrible news for so long. So with that being said, the message that I kind of want to close with you is that hurricanes and flooding are these powerful emotional events. And when the water's rising into your home, there's nothing you can do. Like, the best forecast isn't going to stop it. The time for action is over. But before a storm and after a storm, data is valuable, okay? And so here's the rainfall totals from Harvey. And from basically Houston to Beaumont, you had this area of 40 to 55 inches of rain. And this whole area, this light blue, is basically 25 inches or more of rain. And this is that huge area that was on that forecast map was down here I showed you, and it ended up being up here, but Houston was kind of caught in the middle of it. And Allison was a child compared to this storm. I mean, it was like it was a baby. These are the unprecedented rain totals, and they are. I mean, it was like 2 feet of rain over an area the size of West Virginia. It was unprecedented in terms of the extent of rainfall in a multi-day period. And so, one of the things that we need to really understand as this region thinks about it, was Allison the realistic worst-case scenario, or is this kind of the realistic worst-case scenario? I don't have the idea. I mean, I think it shows that future events like Allison could be, just going to have to plan for them because they're going to happen. I don't think a Harvey happens again soon because the steering currents were so unique. But, I guess what I want to say is that, there was a lot of messaging from politicians and some people, that Harvey was this unforeseeable act of God, right? And that, we're never going to see the likes of it again. And, we'll make some changes and then we'll go on. And that was kind of what was said after Allison. And then 16 years later, something worse comes along. And so what I want to stress, to you guys is that now is the time for data and data science to step forward and be used as a tool by the city and the county to improve preparedness for hurricanes and for flood events in the future. And I just give you one small example. So after Tropical Storm Allison, there was a bunch of money from FEMA, and it kind of got us all, it's act together, and we got updated flood maps, okay? And I'm going to zoom in a minute, but this is a map showing the effective date of FEMA flood maps, and a lot of these are like 20, 30, 40 years old. But if you come down here to Harris County, Houston, they're not old. Check that out. Houston flood maps, January 2017, Conroe 2014, Galveston a little more older because they weren't as affected by Allison. Harris County, though, Fort Bend County, those flood maps are like a couple years old. So we should be set, right? There's parts of Houston that have, in 100-year, 500-year, outside of those plains that have flooded 3-4 times in the last 10 or 15 years. So, I mean, how useful are those updated flood maps? And so, I guess I would close by saying is that we need better data, right? We need more accurate ways of determining who's likely to flood and who's not. And it's not clear to me that a 100-year or a 500-year floodplain is useful anymore. Because first of all, you've got the whole issue of how do you know something's a 500-year flood if you've only been measuring flood data for 50 years? Well, it's statistics, I understand that, but I mean, how useful is that? I mean, does it need to be, it may need to be something more simple like, will flood, probably will flood, may not flood, and for the few houses that are on hills, not going to flood. I mean, that's when you look at the National Hurricane Center Saffir-Simpson scale, it's pretty simple. Category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's, you kind of get away from the statistics. We need to understand the components of this, the flooding, that are due to development and to climate change. And right now, especially for inland flooding where sea level rise isn't that big of an issue, it's mostly development and land use, I think. I don't know for sure. It's been difficult to tease that data out. And finally, what I'd really like to see is better modeling to be able to understand how, flood improvements are going to work. Like the Harris County Flood Control District will go in and widen a channel or a bayou by 5 feet or make it deeper, But is that the best thing they should be doing to mitigating flooding? And where would the buyouts, of low-lying areas, where would those be most effective, cost-effective? And so, with better data, we can, more accurately communicate risk to home buyers. That's very important. Communicate risk to elected officials. That's where I think I can help a little bit. Make wise decisions about where to develop. Know how much. One of the big issues is like, there's some, like if you build a big development, 2,000 home development in West Harris County, maybe you have to put in a small pond or something like that. But we ought to be doing a lot more than that. And so, we need help in sort of answering these critical questions that are going to be coming up. And now that the floodwaters have receded, it's time to get that data. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to take a few questions. So, okay, we'll start right here.
So flooding is a result really of relation between two variables, right? One, the amount of rain coming down, and drainage. And there is something I cannot explain, which is what happened in my area. Saturday actually was not so bad. Sunday was terrible. There was no drainage on Sunday. Even there was a rain, if there was a lull in the rain, the water would not go down. It just kept coming up and up and up. And I went to sleep Sunday night, convinced that we will flood during the night. But sometimes around midnight, suddenly it's like somebody pulled the plug somewhere, and the water started to drain. And that I still have not figured out what happened. Does it have to do with storm surge, with tides? There's a bigger picture here that I don't have yet, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
So the storm center was moving around, and when it was further down the coast, kind of the winds were coming into the bay. And so at high tide, you were getting kind of a surge is too strong of a word for it, but it was kind of the winds were blowing onshore, and so that was blocking it up. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. And the other thing that happened on Saturday night and Sunday morning was the rains downstream of where you were kind of had just filled everything up. And so those areas were still draining into bayous and kind of blocking the upstream drainage from getting out. And so it was probably a combination of those two factors.
Thanks for the very interesting presentation. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on why Harvey was such a slow-moving storm. You mentioned something about the steering current being unique. And I have seen some discussion that the steering currents might have been weakening for the past 5 years or something, although it's all about finding signal in a very short time series. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
So I think that the science on that is not at all concluded. Like, yes, you have seen some comments about how climate change, somehow the warming atmosphere contributed to the weaker steering currents, which allowed Harvey to come inland and just sit there. But as a counterpoint, I could offer you Hurricane Nate, which was moving like at 26 miles per hour to the northwest and then north and northeast this weekend. And like 1 or 2 tropical hurricanes on record at that latitude had moved at that velocity before. And so you've got Harvey going very, very slow, and then you've got, Nate getting the hell out of Dodge as fast as possible. And so I think, more work ought to be done in that area, but for now I would kind of lean to the side of, it was just, it was weather more than it was climate change with regard to the steering currents. Now, climate change, definitely warmer atmosphere can carry more moisture and it would increase rainfall. I think one key question is, did that mean we got like a ½ inch more of rain on average from Harvey because it was warmer, or 3 inches or 6 inches? Don't know. I don't know. And I haven't seen any kind of definitive scientific work in that area. One more here.
Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. So you spent a couple of slides going through some of your headlines in the lead up to the hurricane. And I was wondering if you could comment on what you think you did well and what you think you didn't do well. And in general, how do you go about sort of synthesizing all of the data and uncertainty and communicating that to the public, like what the process that you go through is?
You know, I think what I did well, what I'm happy about is sort of the idea of being the non-hype guy. Because like the feedback that I saw on like Thursday and Friday and Saturday when we were sort of putting out these pretty crazy forecasts was like, you know, oh my, if the non-hype guy is getting freaked out about this, you know, we ought to take it seriously, right? So like, you know, don't cry wolf, and then when there's actually a wolf, cry wolf, and everyone believes you, right? Which was kind of what I was going for. What I'm a little disappointed in is, you know, looking back at like late Saturday night, you know, I was like everyone else, I was kind of freaking out, and what I wish I had done maybe at that point was put up a post maybe about 3 or 4 in the morning with some basic tips for people if water was coming into their home, like the first steps they should be doing to mitigating that damage down the road. But you know, like everyone else that night, I was kind of losing my mind.
I'm going to close with one question myself here, and I'm curious, so has the conversation in the city changed, you think, or in the flood district now that we have these data behind us? Is there hope that it will change, that Houston actually not just Houston, but in general, that we will have a slightly different approach to how we building codes, you know, where we build, what we build?
Well, that really is the key question, and I don't have a definitive answer. I will tell you what I think probably ought to happen, because this isn't just a Harris County problem. This is a regional problem with all the development. And I think, you know, back in the 1970s and 80s when subsidence was recognized as a major issue for this area, so people were pumping groundwater out for drinking water, and it was, you know, like a 13-county or broader area, a subsidence control district was created. The Harris County, or I'm not sure the exact name. The subsidence district was created, and people started relying exclusively on surface water. And that worked. The ground, you know, we stopped sinking. I think a regional flood management or mitigation, not control, district ought to be created. The problem is that's going to require state action. And so you need a somewhat dysfunctional state government to get cities and counties across a broad area to work together, maybe give it some kind of taxing control or maybe not, but basically the authority to make important flood management decisions. I know that's something that Bill King has started talking about and calling for, and so I'd like to see that idea because I think it's a reasonable idea to deal with. And if that happens, then we'll be taking it seriously. If it doesn't, probably the developers are going to get their way.
Join me in thanking Eric Berger again.